March 15th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the central Pacific. The first light touches the surface of an endless ocean, turning the water from black to violet to burning gold. Somewhere in that vastness, hidden among 1,000 nameless atolls, lies a speck of coral barely visible above the tide, a fragment of earth so small it appears on no civilian map, so remote that even the Japanese defenders stationed there believed themselves forgotten by the world. The island has no harbor, no fresh water, no shelter beyond the twisted remains of coconut palms shattered by naval bombardment 3 days prior. The air hangs thick with salt and cordite. Waves crash against jagged coral shelves with a sound like breaking bones. And into this desolation, onto a beach still warm with the memory of violence, comes the first landing craft carrying not marines, not ammunition, not tanks, but bulldozers. 180 men of the 31st Naval Construction Battalion wade through chest-deep surf toward the smoking island. They wear no dress uniforms, carry no rifles beyond their sidearms. Their vessels are not cruisers or destroyers, but flat-bottomed LSTs, whose ramps disgorge tractors, graders, rollers, cement mixers, an entire industrial civilization compressed into steel hulls and hauled 6,000 miles across the Pacific. These men are not young. Many are in their 30s and 40s, too old for the draft. Plucked from construction sites in California and Louisiana and Pennsylvania, where they built highways and dams and bridges across the American continent. They are carpenters, electricians, ironworkers, heavy equipment operators, men who know concrete and steel the way infantrymen know rifles. They have been given a uniform, a rank, and an impossible task: build a fighter airstrip capable of handling Corsairs and Hellcats in 72 hours. On an island that has never known a wheel, on ground that is not earth but compressed coral that shatters drill bits and dulls saw blades within minutes. They call themselves Seabees, construction battalions. The initial CB transformed into something that sounds less like a military designation and more like the thing itself. Industrious, tireless, capable of building anything anywhere. And they step onto that beach as the sun climbs higher, as the heat begins to shimmer off the white coral sand, as the smell of death still rises from pillboxes and spider holes where Japanese defenders died rather than surrender. And they begin to unload their equipment with the calm efficiency of men who have done this before, who will do it again, who understand that wars are won not only with bullets, but with bulldozers. Not only with bombs, but with concrete mixers. Not only with courage, but with the capacity to transform wilderness into airfields in the time it takes most armies to establish a proper perimeter. The officer in command is a lieutenant commander named Robert Thorson, a civil engineer from Seattle who 3 years ago was designing suspension bridges and now finds himself responsible for creating an airbase from nothing, while Japanese snipers still hide in the island's interior and enemy bombers still fly overhead each night. He stands on the beach with blueprints that are already soaked with seawater and salt spray, looking at an island that measures barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its broadest point, covered in shattered palms and shell craters and the wreckage of war. And he knows that what they are being asked to do violates every principle of construction engineering he learned in 20 years of civilian life. You cannot build an airstrip in 3 days. You cannot grade and level and pave 6,000 feet of runway on coral that must first be surveyed, cleared, compacted, surfaced with materials that must be mixed and poured and cured according to specifications that require time. Always time, the one resource they do not have. But Thorson also knows something else, something that separates the Seabees from every other construction force in human history. They are not bound by civilian logic or peacetime schedules. They are the engineering arm of a nation that produces more steel in a month than Japan produces in a year, more cement in a week than Germany produces in a month, more petroleum in a day than the entire Axis combined produces in a week. They are backed by an industrial base so vast it can afford to be wasteful, so powerful it can ship entire factories across oceans, so confident in its abundance that it sends cement mixers and asphalt rollers to islands that most nations would not bother to name. And they carry with them something more valuable than blueprints or equipment. They carry the American presumption that any problem can be solved through sufficient application of machinery, materials, and organized labor, that nature itself can be reshaped to suit strategic necessity, that distance and terrain and impossibility are merely engineering challenges awaiting the proper allocation of resources. They work through that first day without stopping. By noon, bulldozers have cleared a rough path through the wreckage, pushing aside splintered palm trunks and shattered concrete and the twisted metal of Japanese defensive positions, creating a route from the beach to the center of the island where the airstrip will run. By evening, engineers have completed the initial survey using techniques that would horrify their civilian counterparts. No time for precise measurements and careful calculations, only rough estimates made with transits held by men standing in still warm bomb craters, citing lines across terrain that shifts underfoot because the coral is not solid but porous, not stable but treacherous, not Earth as engineers understand Earth, but something alien and hostile that seems designed by geology to resist human construction. They drive stakes into the ground to mark the runway's borders, 6,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, oriented to catch the prevailing wind that blows steadily from the southeast, parallel to the island's longest axis because there is no room for alternatives, no space for the generous margins that peacetime construction would demand. And even as they survey and stake and mark, other crews are unloading supplies from the LSTs that continue to arrive through the surf, steel mast and matting in 10-foot sections, each piece weighing 65 pounds, interlocking panels that can be laid directly onto prepared ground to create an instant runway surface, strong enough to handle aircraft weighing 10 tons. Timber pilings and lumber for revetments and Quonset huts, fuel bladders that hold 10,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, generators and floodlights because the work will not stop when darkness falls. Water purification equipment because the island has no fresh water and men cannot work at this pace without drinking constantly in heat that reaches 100 degrees by midday and never falls below 80 even at midnight. Medical supplies because accidents are inevitable when men operate heavy machinery at this speed, in this heat, under these conditions. And ammunition, always ammunition, because the island is not secure, because Japanese stragglers still hide in caves along the shoreline, because enemy bombers based 200 miles north will certainly strike once they realize what is happening here. That first night, as the Seabees work under portable floodlights that turn the coral white as bone, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft appear overhead, twin-engine bombers circling at high altitude, too high for anti-aircraft fire, but close enough to photograph the construction, to count the landing craft, to calculate what this means. The work does not stop. Men continue to operate bulldozers and graders while the bombs fall, while explosions throw coral fragments like shrapnel, while the night fills with the sound of engines and detonations and the steady mechanical rhythm of construction that pauses only when a bomb lands close enough to force crews to take cover in the foxholes they have dug between work shifts. And when the bombers leave, trailing smoke where one was struck by a lucky anti-aircraft burst, the work resumes immediately because the schedule allows for no delays, because fighter aircraft stationed at Guadalcanal and Tarawa are already being loaded for the ferry flight that will bring them here, because naval planners 3,000 miles away have based their next offensive operation on the assumption that this airstrip will be operational in 72 hours, and they have neither contingency plans nor alternatives. This is war as the Americans fight it in 1944, not through superior courage or tactical brilliance or warrior spirit, but through superior logistics and industrial capacity and the absolute conviction that any problem can be overcome by throwing sufficient resources at it fast enough. The Japanese defenders who held this island believed they were defending a strategic position. They died thinking their sacrifice mattered, that the coral and the ocean and the sheer remoteness of this place would make it too costly for the Americans to hold. They could not imagine an enemy that would bring concrete mixers across 6,000 miles of ocean, that would deploy construction battalions as readily as combat battalions, that would commit engineers and equipment to building an air base on an island barely large enough to hold it, and would do so in 3 days because waiting a week is strategically unacceptable. By dawn of the second day, the initial clearing is complete. The runway path has been stripped of vegetation and major obstacles, leaving a scar of exposed coral running down the island's center like a wound. And now begins the real work, the engineering challenge that would be difficult on solid ground with unlimited time and is nearly impossible here. Now, under these conditions, preparing the surface to receive the maston matting. Coral is not soil. It does not compact like earth or level like clay. It is porous and brittle, resistant to conventional grading equipment, sharp enough to tear rubber tracks and shred tires. The coral fragments cut exposed skin, work their way into boots and gloves and collars, create infections that spread rapidly in the tropical heat. And the ground is not level, but rises and falls in irregular waves, in ridges and depressions created by ancient tides and modern bombardment, requiring extensive cutting and filling, excavating the high spots and using that material to fill the low spots, creating a level surface through brute force and constant adjustment. The bulldozers work in pairs, one cutting while the other fills, operators navigating by eye and instinct because there is no time for precise surveying, no opportunity to reference elevation benchmarks and grade stakes every few yards as civilian practice would require. They work by feel, experienced operators who can tell from the way their machine responds whether they are cutting too deep or not deep enough, who understand the relationship between blade angle and ground resistance, who have spent decades learning to shape Earth, and who must now apply that knowledge to coral that behaves differently from anything they have encountered before. Behind the bulldozers come the motor graders, massive machines with articulated blades that can level ground to within an inch of specified grade. Operators working with a precision that seems impossible, given the speed and the conditions, cutting high spots and spreading the material, creating a surface that is rough but increasingly level, increasingly capable of supporting the weight of aircraft that will land here at 100 miles per hour, that will brake and turn and taxi on this coral. Foundation without sinking or sliding or catching fire when wheels meet surface at the wrong angle. And behind the graders come the compactors, steel-wheeled rollers weighing 10 tons, dragged back and forth across the prepared surface to compress the coral into something approaching solidity, creating density where there was porosity, creating strength where there was fragility. The coral resists. It crunches and splinters under the steel wheels. It sends up clouds of fine white dust that coats everything, that gets into lungs and eyes and machinery, that turns the Seabees into ghost figures moving through a fog of their own creation. The heat is relentless. Men drink water by the gallon and sweat it out immediately, their uniforms soaked through within minutes of beginning work, their skin burned red despite the coconut oil some smear on as makeshift sunscreen. They work in shifts, but the shifts blur together because there is always something that needs doing. Always another section to clear or grade or compact. Always another problem that requires immediate solution. At midday on the second day, a complication. The LST carrying the bulk of the mast and matting runs aground on the reef 200 yards offshore, hold below the waterline when coral punches through steel plating designed to beach on sand, but not to navigate these razor-sharp formations. The ship cannot approach closer and cannot retract. Its cargo, 50 tons of steel runway matting, the very material that will transform this graded coral into a functioning airstrip, sits trapped in holds that are beginning to flood with seawater. A civilian contractor would halt work, assess the situation, develop a plan, request additional resources. The Seabees solve the problem in 30 minutes. They rig a floating causeway using pontoon sections intended for a pier, run a steel cable from the stranded LST to a bulldozer on the beach, and begin offloading the matting panels directly into the surf, where teams of men wrestle the 65-pound sections onto the pontoons and float them to shore. It is brutal work. Waves knock men off their feet, coral cuts tear through gloves and boots, the matting panels are slippery and awkward and heavy enough to drag a man underwater if he loses his grip. But it works. By evening, all 50 tons of matting are stacked on the beach, ready to be transported inland to the runway site. The stranded LST is a total loss, settling deeper onto the reef with each tide. But its cargo is saved. And that is all that matters, because ships can be replaced and men can be replaced, but the schedule cannot be changed. That second night, more air raids. The Japanese understand now what is happening, understand the strategic implications of an American airfield at this location, positioned to intercept their supply convoys and provide fighter escort for bombers striking northward toward the home islands. They commit 24 aircraft to destroying the construction site, more planes than they can afford to lose, more than the tactical situation justifies, but they recognize that if this airstrip becomes operational, it will shorten the American advance by months, will move the front line another 300 miles closer to Tokyo, will shift the calculus of the Pacific War in ways that no amount of later sacrifice can reverse. And so they come in waves through the darkness, guided by the glare of the Seabees floodlights, which cannot be extinguished because work cannot stop, dropping bombs and strafing with machine guns, while anti-aircraft batteries return fire and night fighters scramble from distant bases but arrive too late to intercept more than a handful of the attackers. Fire and burns until morning, its steel frame warped by heat into something that looks like modern sculpture. A fuel bladder ruptures, spilling 10,000 gallons of aviation gasoline that ignites in a fireball visible for miles, burning with such intensity that the coral underneath fuses into glass. And still the work continues. Crews drag away the wreckage, fill the new bomb craters, adjust schedules and assignments to account for lost equipment and reduced manpower. By midnight, they are back on schedule. By dawn of the third day, they are ahead of schedule. This is when the true character of the Seabees reveals itself, not in the technical skill of their engineering, impressive though that is, but in their refusal to acknowledge impossibility. They are not soldiers trained to assault fortifications or hold defensive lines. They are construction workers, civilians in uniform, men who in peacetime would walk off a job if conditions became unsafe or schedules became unreasonable. But they do not walk away. They work through exhaustion that would hospitalize men in civilian life, through heat that causes half the battalion to show symptoms of heat stroke by the end of the second day, through danger that kills and maims with the same randomness as frontline combat. They work because the Marines who took this island 3 days ago died expecting it to matter. Because the pilots who will land here need this runway to survive. Because somewhere in the vast strategic machinery of the Pacific War, someone has calculated that this island in this position at this moment is essential and has sent the Seabees to make that calculation reality. On the morning of the third day, the moment arrives, laying the Marston matting. The coral base has been graded and compacted, surveyed and approved by engineers who have signed off on specifications that would never pass civilian inspection but are adequate for military necessity. The matting comes in 10-foot sections, each panel punched with circular holes to reduce weight and provide drainage. each edge designed to interlock with the next through a simple tongue-and-groove system that requires no fasteners, no welding, no time-consuming assembly. In theory, it is simple. Position the first panel, align the second, lock them together, repeat 600 times until the runway is complete. In practice, on coral that is not perfectly level, in heat that makes the steel panels too hot to touch with bare hands. With the deadline now measured in hours rather than days, it becomes a feat of coordination and endurance that pushes the Seabees to the absolute limit of human capability. They work in teams of 6, 2 men to carry each panel from the stockpile to the runway's edge, 2 to position it, 2 to lock it into place with the adjacent panel. Each panel weighs 65 pounds, not impossibly heavy for one man in ideal conditions, but crushing when carried 200 yards through soft coral sand in 100-degree heat, repeated hundreds of times, without rest. The panels cut hands even through gloves. They slip and shift during positioning, requiring constant adjustment. They heat in the sun until touching them raises blisters, and they must be laid with precision, because a misaligned panel creates a gap or ridge that will catch an aircraft's wheel during landing, potentially causing a crash that will close the runway and negate 3 days of superhuman effort. The work develops its own rhythm: lift, carry, position, lock, repeat. No conversation, no wasted motion. Each team moving in unconscious coordination developed through necessity. Panels spread across the coral like metallic scales, creating a gleaming path that extends northward down the island's center, growing longer with each hour, each team's progress visible to every other team, so that competition emerges spontaneously, not official or encouraged, but inevitable. Among men who have spent their lives measuring productivity in concrete poured and steel placed, who understand their work through numbers, feet completed, tons laid, hours remaining. The panels click together with a sound like rifle bolts, hundreds of metallic snaps that form a continuous percussion beneath the industrial drone of generators and the rhythmic crash of waves and the high whine of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that continue to circle overhead, photographing but not attacking because the daylight makes low-altitude bombing too dangerous, and the runway is not yet complete enough to justify expending more aircraft. By noon, they have laid 3,000 feet, halfway to the goal. By evening, 4,500 feet are down, and the end is visible, close enough that men allow themselves to believe they will actually achieve this impossible thing. And then the final complication, the crisis that threatens to undo everything. A structural failure in the coral base near the runway's northern end. A grader operator notices it first, a subtle depression forming in the matting where none existed an hour before, panels settling unevenly, creating a visible dip in what should be a level surface. Investigation reveals the problem: the coral underneath, inadequately compacted due to time constraints, is compressing under the weight of the matting, creating a subsidence that will worsen when aircraft land and apply dynamic loads far greater than the static weight of the panels. The depression is only 3 inches deep, but that is enough to be catastrophic. A fighter landing at high speed will hit that dip and bounce, possibly losing control, possibly cartwheeling into the other parked aircraft that will soon line this runway. The solution is straightforward in theory: remove the affected panels, regrade and recompact the coral base, relay the matting. In practice, with darkness falling and the deadline now less than 12 hours away, it means tearing up 500 feet of runway that took 6 hours to install and doing that work over again while maintaining the overall schedule. It means accepting that all the progress of the afternoon will be undone, that men already working beyond exhaustion will have to find reserves of energy that may not exist. And it means making a decision that Lieutenant Commander Thorson understands will define his career and possibly his life: proceed with the repair and miss the deadline, or accept the flawed runway and risk aircraft and pilots. He orders the repair. They tear up the panels in darkness, working under floodlights that turn the worksite into a theater stage surrounded by black ocean. They excavate the settled coral, haul in fresh material from the island's southern end, grade and compact with a care that contradicts the desperate speed of everything else they have done. And they relay the matting panel by panel, team by team, each man understanding that this is the moment when excellence matters more than speed, when the construction workers' pride in craftsmanship overrides the military imperative for rapid completion. They work through the night without the interruption of air raids. The Japanese bombers do not come, perhaps because they believe the work has failed, perhaps because they are conserving aircraft for more critical targets, perhaps through simple luck. And by dawn of what is technically the fourth day, 76 hours after the first bulldozer hit the beach, the last panel locks into place. 6,000 feet of runway lie before them, gleaming in the early light, a strip of industrial civilization imposed upon wilderness through willpower and machinery. It is not beautiful. The matting is scarred and dented from handling. The edges are ragged where they meet the island's natural terrain. The surface shows imperfections that would never be tolerated on a civilian airfield. But it is complete. It is functional. And at 06:30 on March 19, 1944, barely 3 days after construction began, the first aircraft appears on the horizon. A Marine Corsair whose pilot has been radioed the airstrip's coordinates and told to land despite having no confirmation that the runway is truly ready. No assurance beyond the word of engineers who sound exhausted beyond reason when they transmit clearance to approach. The Corsair circles once, pilot inspecting the runway from 500 feet, looking at what must appear to be an impossibility, a fully operational airstrip on an island that 3 days ago was a contested battlefield. The landing gear drops. The fighter descends, lining up on the runway centerline, sinking toward the Coral Island at 120 miles per hour, with its propeller ticking over and its weight carried entirely by faith in American engineering. Wheels touch matting. Steel kisses steel with a shriek that echoes across the island. The Corsair bounces slightly, the very outcome Thorson feared, but the bounce is minor, within tolerances, nothing the pilot cannot handle. The fighter rolls down the runway, decelerating, leaving tire marks on the matting, and comes to a stop 4,000 feet down the strip with 2,000 feet to spare. The pilot climbs out, pulls off his helmet, looks around at an island that still smells of death and coral dust and aviation fuel. 172 Seabees stand along the runway's edge, men in torn uniforms and improvised bandages, some leaning on shovels because they are too exhausted to stand unsupported, all watching this single aircraft as though it is the most important thing in the world, which at this moment, for them, it is. Because this aircraft proves that their work matters, that the impossible thing they have done has meaning beyond the immediate tactical situation. That somewhere in the vast accounting of the Pacific War, their 3 days of superhuman effort will be recorded not as footnotes, but as essential contributions to victory. The pilot walks to where Thorson stands, salutes formally despite the informality of the surroundings, and delivers a message that has come from Admiral Nimitz himself. 12 more fighters are en route, arriving within the hour. A full squadron will be based here by tomorrow. Long-range bombers will stage through this field within a week, and because of this runway, because of what the Seabees have built in 3 days, the American advance will proceed on schedule, will actually proceed ahead of schedule, compressing the Pacific War's timeline by weeks, possibly months, bringing the final confrontation with Japan measurably closer. But to understand how this moment came to be, why American construction battalions can perform feats that defy engineering logic and military precedent, one must look backward through the history that created the Seabees, must understand the unique combination of industrial capacity, tactical necessity, and national character that made such organizations possible. Before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, before anyone imagined that construction workers would need to wear uniforms and operate under fire. The United States Navy had no organized engineering capability beyond the Civil Engineer Corps, staff officers who designed bases in peacetime but had no operational role in combat, no capacity to deploy forward and build under fire. The assumption was that construction happened in rear areas, safely behind front lines, conducted by civilian contractors working at civilian pace. The assumption, like so many peacetime assumptions, died at Pearl Harbor when Japanese aircraft destroyed facilities that took years to build and made clear that any Pacific war would require the rapid construction of bases across thousands of miles of ocean, on islands that lacked infrastructure under conditions of constant enemy action. The Navy turned to civilian construction companies, offered contracts for overseas work, and discovered that civilian contractors would not deploy to combat zones without guarantees that could not be provided: protection from enemy action, insurance coverage, evacuation plans, safety standards that were impossible to maintain on contested islands. The contractors were willing to work in Hawaii, in Australia, in rear areas where the risk was manageable. But they would not build airfields under bombardment, would not operate bulldozers while being strafed, would not accept the casualties that frontline construction would inevitably entail. And without them, the Navy had no way to build the bases that the Pacific strategy required, no way to transform coral atolls into aircraft carriers, no way to project power across an ocean that measured 5,000 miles from Hawaii to the Philippines. The solution emerged from necessity: militarize the construction workers themselves. Give them ranks, uniforms, military discipline. Make them subject to naval law so they cannot quit or refuse orders. Arm them sufficiently to defend themselves, but keep their primary identity as builders rather than fighters. And most importantly, recruit not young men fresh from civilian life, but experienced construction workers in their 30s and 40s. Men with decades of practical engineering knowledge. Men who know how to operate every piece of heavy equipment, how to solve problems with improvised solutions, how to work under pressure because they have spent their entire lives meeting deadlines and staying within budgets. Create, in effect, a construction force that combines civilian expertise with military discipline, that can build like contractors but deploy like Marines, that can operate in combat zones but remains focused on construction rather than combat. The first Seabees battalions formed in early 1942, drawing recruits from construction sites across America. They trained at Camp Peary in Virginia and Camp Endicott in Rhode Island, learning basic military protocol, saluting, marching, military courtesy, but spending most of their time on practical engineering: how to unload equipment from landing craft in surf, how to build with materials available locally, how to operate efficiently under blackout conditions, how to construct while under fire. They learned that in combat engineering, speed matters more than perfection, that a runway finished in 3 days is infinitely more valuable than a runway finished in 3 weeks, even if the former is rougher and requires more maintenance. They learned to think in terms of minimum acceptable standards rather than ideal specifications, to calculate how much strength is enough rather than how much strength is possible, to accept that their work will be temporary because the war itself is temporary and today's emergency airstrip may be tomorrow's abandoned relic. And they learned that they would be casualties, not in the mass numbers of infantry divisions, but steadily, persistently, killed by accidents and disease and enemy action in numbers that would shock civilian construction sites, killed by bombs and artillery like soldiers, but also by bulldozer accidents and crane collapses and equipment failures that peacetime safety protocols would prevent. The Seabees accepted this because they were volunteers, because they believed in the cause, because they carried with them a peculiarly American confidence that any problem, including the problem of dying while building an airfield, could be addressed through proper organization and sufficient determination. By 1944, When the 31st Naval Construction Battalion arrives at that nameless coral atoll, the Seabees have become an essential element of Pacific strategy. They have built airfields on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, constructed harbors at Espiritu Santo and Ulithi, created fuel storage depots and ammunition dumps and field hospitals and barracks on 100 islands that appear in no civilian atlas. They have developed techniques unique to their role, prefabricated components that can be assembled rapidly, modular designs that require minimal modification for different locations, standardized procedures that allow different battalions to work interchangeably. They have learned to build on coral and volcanic sand and jungle mud, to construct in typhoons and earthquakes and 100-degree heat. They have learned to work around enemy resistance, sometimes building under fire, sometimes clearing Japanese holdouts from caves before construction can begin, always operating with the understanding that their work makes them targets because the enemy recognizes that destroying a half-built airfield can be strategically more valuable than attacking a completed one, and they have developed a reputation, both among American forces and the enemy, as men who can do the impossible, who can build faster and better under worse conditions than any construction force in history. Japanese intelligence officers studying American capabilities consistently underestimate CB construction timelines, calculating that airfield projects will take weeks when in fact they take days, basing defensive strategies on assumptions about American engineering capabilities that prove catastrophically wrong. The Germans, facing similar American construction operations in Europe, react with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Their own engineering units, though technically competent, operate at a fraction of the Seabees' pace because they lack the equipment, the materials, and above all, the industrial backing that allows Americans to treat machinery and supplies as disposable rather than precious. What neither enemy fully grasps is that the Seabees are not extraordinary engineers performing extraordinary feats. They are ordinary engineers backed by extraordinary resources. The man operating a bulldozer on that coral atoll in March 1944 is not more skilled than his German or Japanese counterpart. But he has a bulldozer that was manufactured 3 months ago in a factory that produces 20 more every day, shipped across 6,000 miles of ocean on vessels that exist by the hundreds, supported by a supply chain so robust that if his machine breaks down, it will be replaced within days rather than months. He has fuel delivered in such abundance that he does not need to conserve it, does not need to make difficult choices about whether to use his equipment or save it for a more critical moment. He has tools and materials in quantities that allow him to waste them, to use 10 pounds of steel where 5 would suffice in more careful hands, to pour cement with generous margins rather than precise calculations. He is, in essence, the beneficiary of American industrial abundance applied to military engineering, and that abundance, more than any individual skill or courage, explains how coral atolls become airfields in 72 hours. On that third evening, after the Corsair has landed successfully and the initial wave of aircraft has arrived, Lieutenant Commander Thorson gathers his battalion for what becomes an impromptu celebration. They have no alcohol, Navy regulations forbid it, but they have something almost as precious: hot food. The field kitchens have been set up during the runway construction, and now Navy cooks produce the meal that has sustained American forces through every theater of the war: steak, potatoes, canned vegetables, white bread, butter, coffee, and for dessert, ice cream manufactured aboard the refrigeration ship that arrived yesterday, and that seems to the exhausted Seabees like a luxury from a dream. Impossible in this heat and this desolation, but real nonetheless, cold and sweet and abundant enough that men eat seconds and thirds without being rationed. They eat in silence mostly, too tired for conversation, sitting on equipment crates and fallen palm logs, watching the sun set over an ocean that carried them here and will eventually carry them home. And some begin to recognize, perhaps for the first time, the strangeness of what they are experiencing, that they are eating steak and ice cream on an island that 3 days ago was a battlefield, that they are surrounded by abundance in the midst of devastation, that they represent a nation so wealthy it can ship ice cream to coral atolls, while their enemies struggle to deliver basic ammunition and rations to frontline troops. This is the symbolism that defines the American war effort, though the Seabees themselves rarely articulate it. Food as ideology, abundance as weapon. The steak they eat represents cattle ranches in Texas, slaughterhouses in Chicago, refrigeration systems that can preserve meat through months of ocean transport, logistics networks capable of delivering fresh food to men thousands of miles from home. The ice cream represents even more: dairy farms in Wisconsin, sugar plantations in Hawaii, machinery that can manufacture frozen desserts in tropical heat, refrigeration ships that serve no tactical purpose beyond maintaining morale. These things are not military necessities. Soldiers can fight on much simpler diets, but they are American necessities. Expressions of a national conviction that citizens in uniform deserve not just adequate support, but generous support. That asking men to risk their lives in combat obligates the nation to provide them with the comforts of civilization wherever possible. The Japanese soldiers who defended this island died with bellies empty except for rice and seaweed. Their rations reduced to near starvation levels because Japan's merchant fleet cannot deliver supplies faster than American submarines sink ships. The Germans fighting in Europe operate on strict rationing, their food supplies calculated to provide minimum calories rather than satisfaction. Their logistics prioritizing ammunition and fuel because there is never enough of either. But Americans eat steak on coral atolls, drink fresh coffee brewed from beans shipped 6,000 miles, consume ice cream manufactured aboard ships designed specifically to produce frozen desserts for military personnel. This abundance is not accidental or frivolous. It is strategic. It communicates to every serviceman that he fights for a nation so powerful it can afford to be generous, so wealthy it can provide luxury alongside necessity, so confident of victory that it spends resources on morale as readily as on material. And when the war ends, when Japanese and German prisoners return home with stories of their captivity, the detail they mention most frequently, more than military strength or tactical skill, is American food. They speak of the shock of receiving 3 full meals daily, of meat in quantities they have not seen since before the war, of white bread and chocolate and cigarettes distributed with a casualness that suggests infinite supply. They speak of gaining weight as prisoners while their own civilians starved, of being fed better by their captors than by their own military, of realizing through food alone that they have been fighting a nation whose resources are so vast that feeding prisoners costs nothing, changes nothing, represents merely the baseline expectation of how human beings should be treated. The steak and ice cream on that coral atoll, then, are not just morale boosters. They are demonstrations of power more convincing than any propaganda, more persuasive than any ideology. They prove through the most basic human need, food, that America fights from a position of such abundance that it can afford to be humane, can afford to be generous, can afford to treat even construction work in combat zones as deserving of the same consideration given to civilian labor. The Seabees eating dinner on March 19, 1944, are consuming not just calories but proof of concept, evidence that they represent a way of war that their enemies cannot match because they cannot match the industrial base that makes such war possible. In the weeks that follow, that coral atoll becomes what Seabee engineers envisioned, a fully operational airbase supporting 2 fighter squadrons and serving as a refueling stop for long-range bombers striking Japanese positions to the north. The runway that took 3 days to build functions for 18 months until the war moves beyond its range, and it is abandoned to the jungle and the tide. By 1950, no trace remains visible from the air. The mast and matting has been salvaged or corroded away. The coral has reclaimed the graded surface. The island has returned to the obscurity from which American military necessity briefly pulled it. The naval officers who planned the base have moved on to other operations. The pilots who flew from that runway have gone home or died in combat elsewhere. And the Seabees themselves have scattered back to civilian life. Returning to construction sites in California and Louisiana and Pennsylvania, building the highways and suburbs and shopping centers of post-war America with the same efficiency they once applied to coral airstrips, but the significance of what they did echoes. Forward through military history, every American military operation since 1944 has depended on the same capability the Seabees demonstrated. The ability to project not just combat power but construction power, not just weapons but infrastructure, not just soldiers but the entire industrial civilization that supports them. When American forces establish bases in Iraq or Afghanistan or any remote location, they do so with the same presumption the Seabees brought to the Pacific, that distance and terrain and hostile conditions are merely engineering problems, that any location can be transformed into a functional military installation given sufficient machinery and materials and organized labor, that the difference between wilderness and civilization is merely a matter of time and resources, and that America possesses both in abundance. The three-day airstrip is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a footnote to the Pacific War, one small base among hundreds, one construction project among thousands. But it represents something larger than its immediate tactical value. It represents the moment when American industrial abundance translated most directly into military capability, when the prosperity and productivity that characterized American civilian life became weapons as effective as any bomb or bullet. The Seabees building that runway in 72 hours were not performing miracles. They were performing American industrial capitalism at its most efficient, most focused, most ruthlessly effective. They were demonstrating that in modern war, victory belongs not to the side with the most courage or the best soldiers or the most brilliant tactics, but to the side that can transform resources into capability faster and more efficiently than the enemy, and that in this competition, in 1944, America has no rival. There is a photograph taken on the afternoon of the third day, after the runway's completion but before the celebratory meal. It shows 50 or 60 Seabees standing along the runway's edge, looking at the camera with expressions too complex to categorize simply as triumph or exhaustion. They are covered in coral dust that has turned their uniforms ghostly white. Many are shirtless, their torsos burned dark by the tropical sun. Some lean on tools, shovels, sledgehammers, wrenches, as though the tools are the only things keeping them upright. Behind them, the steel matting stretches away into the distance, a gleaming industrial artifact imposed upon wilderness, and beyond that, the ocean and the empty horizon. The photograph captures something the Seabees themselves might not have articulated: the peculiar American faith that any problem can be solved through sufficient application of resources and will, that nature itself can be reshaped to serve human purposes. That impossibility is merely a failure of imagination or effort. This faith, more than any weapon or tactic, explains American military success in World War II. It explains how an island 6,000 miles from California can host fighter squadrons within a week of its capture. It explains how the Pacific War, which Japan expected to fight for years, compressed into a timeline that made Japanese strategic planning obsolete. It explains, ultimately, how a nation that in 1941 had a smaller military than Romania became by 1945 the dominant military power on Earth. The Seabees did not win the war, but they made victory possible by ensuring that American forces never lacked the infrastructure combat requires, the airfields and harbors and supply depots and fuel, storage and ammunition dumps, and field hospitals that modern war demands. They operated in obscurity, rarely mentioned in news reports, never glorified in propaganda films, doing work that seems prosaic compared to fighter pilots and Marines, but that was equally essential. They proved that in modern war, construction is combat, that engineers are as vital as infantrymen, that the men who build runways contribute as much to victory as the men who fly from them, and they proved it by building a 6,000-foot airstrip on a coral island in 72 hours, not because it was easy or safe or reasonable, but because the strategic situation demanded it, and they had been sent to make the impossible real. Evening falls on that coral atoll. On March 19th, 1944, the Seabees sleep for the first time in 3 days, collapsed in tents and foxholes, and anywhere flat enough to lie down. The fighter squadron settles in, pilots claiming revetments and checking over aircraft, already planning the next day's combat patrols. The ocean continues its eternal rhythm against the reef. Stars emerge in a sky empty now of enemy aircraft, empty of threat, peaceful in the way that only remote islands can be peaceful when war has moved on to other locations. And the runway stands, 6,000 feet of American engineering and determination, steel panels locked together on crushed coral, ready to receive the weight of war. It will last 18 months before obsolescence and the advancing front line make it irrelevant. But for those 18 months, it will serve exactly the purpose for which it was built, will launch thousands of combat sorties, will save dozens of damaged aircraft that limp home on failing engines and land here rather than ditching in the ocean, will serve as tangible proof that American forces can operate anywhere, can build anything, can transform any environment to serve strategic necessity. The Seabees who built it will move on to the next island, the next impossible deadline, the next coral atoll that must become an airfield faster than engineering logic says is possible. They will build runways on Saipan and Tinian and Iwo Jima, each one constructed under fire, each one completed ahead of schedule, each one essential to the American advance. Some will die in the building, killed by accidents or enemy action or disease, and be buried in temporary cemeteries that will eventually be relocated or absorbed back into the earth. Some will survive the war and return home to build the interstate highways and the suburbs and the commercial infrastructure of post-war America, applying the lessons learned on coral atolls to civilian projects, building with the same efficiency if not the same urgency. And decades later, when historians calculate how the Pacific War was won, they will cite aircraft carriers and submarines, amphibious assaults and island-hopping strategy, atomic bombs, and Japanese surrender. They will mention logistics, but only in passing, infrastructure, but only as footnote. The Seabees will be remembered, if at all, as supporting players, necessary perhaps, but not central to the narrative of combat and victory. But the pilots who flew from that coral runway knew different. The Marines who took the next island, knowing they would have air support within days, knew different. The Japanese commanders watching American aircraft operate from bases that should not exist knew different. They all understood what historians sometimes forget, that modern war is won not by the side that fights best, but by the side that builds fastest. That logistics defeats tactics, that the ability to transform coral into concrete matters as much as the ability to transform civilians into soldiers. The 3-day airstrip stands as monument to that truth, a monument that no longer exists physically, but that remains embedded in military doctrine and strategic planning, in the Seabee battalions that still deploy to remote locations, in the American presumption that any location can become a base, any terrain can become operational, any distance can be overcome through sufficient resources and organized will. It stands as proof that abundance itself is power, that a nation wealthy enough to ship ice cream to coral atolls can win wars that poorer nations cannot, that the same industrial capacity that produces cars and refrigerators and suburban homes can produce victory when directed toward military ends, not through superior courage or tactical genius, but through the simple, overwhelming application of machinery and materials and men who know how to build anything anywhere under any conditions. 3 days, 72 hours, 180 men and 50 machines, 6,000 feet of runway on an island that had no name until it became necessary to name it, that has no name now because it no longer matters, that stands nameless in history except as evidence of what American engineering could accomplish when necessity demanded and resources permitted. The ocean washes against the coral reef where that runway once stood. The jungle reclaimed it decades ago. The steel matting rusted and was salvaged or disappeared. The Seabees who built it are mostly gone now, claimed by time if not by war. But what they built remains, not physically but conceptually, remains as proof that in modern war, the side that can build fastest wins. And in 1944, no nation could build like America. That is the truth written in coral and steel matting, in bulldozer tracks and cement mixers, in the 3-day miracle that was no miracle at all, but merely American industrial civilization, applied to military necessity with the same efficiency it applied to everything else. The same abundance, the same confidence that any problem can be solved if sufficient resources are brought to bear quickly enough. And on a coral island in the Central Pacific, for 72 hours in March 1944, that truth became an airstrip, built by men who were old enough to know better, under conditions that should have made it impossible. On a deadline that violated every principle of engineering logic, they built it anyway, because they were Seabees. Because someone needed a runway, because, in the vast industrial machine that was America at war, building the impossible was simply another job that needed doing, and it was done.